thought, let's keep watching.
Alright, so everything that you say now is being recorded. Alright, so what I wanted to cover today was two main things, yeah, because I've noticed that when you talk about the impacts on changes in the exchange rate on the economy, some of you get a bit confused as to what you need to talk about. So there are two main changes which result in different implications. So I'm going to write those two up. So I guess the heading, if you want to write a heading, is the impact. Cool. So it's the impact of changes in the exchange rate on the economy. So I'm going to tell you those two situations. The first situation is if the exchange rate depreciates. I'm going to stick with the depreciation side of things because that's probably the most relevant for what we're covering in the course this year. So if the exchange rate depreciates, so if it depreciates due to a negative shock, and this excludes a lower terms of trade, okay? Because you know, and we have covered that if the terms of trade declines, the Australian dollar declines. So we've covered that. So there's a positive relationship between the terms of trade and the Australian dollar. But the exchange rate can also decline for other reasons, okay? So I'll give you an example. If there is a major global economic crisis, so for example with the GFC, so when that happened, the Australian dollar depreciated, okay? The second situation we're going to cover is if the exchange rate depreciates because of a fall in the terms of trade. So these are two separate situations, okay? So we're going to go through them one by one. Alright, so situation one. So the key takeaway I want you to definitely remember when it comes to depreciations is depreciations, and this is what we covered earlier today, so they are expansionary. So that means if the Australian dollar depreciates, then GDP increases. So why is it the case that GDP increases? It is mainly because of an increase in net exports, okay? So how does that actually work? So I'll step through the process. Again, it's going to sound fairly familiar because we've covered this before, but that's okay. So the first step is the Australian dollar depreciates. Second step is we can say countries that buy our exports, so they end up paying less. And the important thing over here is they pay less, but they pay less in their foreign currency, okay? So they pay less, I'm going to put using their own currency. For the same amount of goods. I'm going to just put down goods and services just to make it broad. Okay. So countries that buy our exports pay less using their own currency for the same amount of goods and services. So I want to ask you, what happens to our competitiveness? So competitiveness. Does it go up? Yep, good. So our competitiveness increases, yeah? So it increases because non-residents need to pay less. So what about our purchasing power? Yeah, good. So it decreases because the Australian dollar is now worth less. So we can only import fewer goods and services. So using these two as, I guess, indicators, you could say. So if our competitiveness goes up, our exports go up. If our purchasing power goes down, our imports go down. So what that does is the net impact results in an increase in net exports. So does anyone have questions about situation 1? So just remember, we have not spoken about short-term, long-term changes in the immediate future versus later down the track. This is how you would describe the impacts of a depreciation of the Australian dollar. Okay? So it'll make a bit more sense once we cover situation 2, which is when we start talking about the trade balance, when we start talking about the J-curve, and those related issues. Okay, so that is situation number 1. Now, cool. So now we're going to move on to situation number 2. And this is different from situation 1 because in this case the terms of trade fall. So that is the source of the depreciation, and as a result the Australian dollar depreciates. Alright, with this so step number 1, terms of trade falls. We know that the terms of trade is export prices over import prices times 100. And if the terms of trade falls, export prices decline or import prices increase. Doesn't matter which way it is. But the decline in the terms of trade, as you have learned, is an unfavorable move. Okay, and we're going to find out why that's an unfavorable move in a second. So a few of you, when you needed to talk about the terms of trade in your assessment, a few of you moved straight into the step number 2 of situation 1. So you went to say that because the terms of trade drove the Australian dollar lower, then we are more competitive, so then our exports increase and our imports decline. And then GDP increases. So why is that not correct? And I'm going to give you a hint. It relates to the trade balance. And the trade balance looks like this. Okay, so that's the equation for the trade balance. So what would happen to the trade balance if the terms of trade declines? This is where short-term and long-term comes into play. Yeah, good. So it would decrease, yeah? Because I've already labelled that export prices go down. So this is where I added a colour. You would say in the short term. So the export price goes down and the import price goes up. So both can happen or each can happen. It depends on the situation, but let's just assume both happens. If that occurs, then the trade balance would fall. Yeah, so because the total, so XP, that would fall, and that would increase. Okay, so just to break that down. Cool. So that's the short term. Okay, so I'll just write that down to make it clear. So the trade balance declines, and when the trade balance declines, that will result in lower net exports, because we're receiving less for our exports and we're having to pay more for our imports. So that means a decline in net exports, and that means a decline in GDP potentially. But this is only in the short term. So only in the short term. So now we're going to talk about long term. So in the long term, what happens to volumes, which doesn't happen in the short term? What do you reckon? Yep. Yeah, good. So volumes can change. Yeah. In the long term, people can adjust what they decide to buy and sell based on the new prices. So if you know that our export prices have declined, what our trading partners will do is that they will decide to increase the amount that they buy because it's cheaper. Okay? So in this case, in the long term, we're going to see the trade balance change, and we're going to see the volumes side of things increase. And when imports become more expensive, what would happen to import volumes? What do we think? So what do we think happens to import volumes when imports become more expensive? What do you reckon? So, yeah, good. It's a decrease. So imports become more expensive, import volumes go down, and that results in a decline in the trade balance. Oh, oops, one second, increase. Yes, an increase of the trade balance. Okay, so the left side goes up, the right side goes down, the trade balance goes up. So you can say in the long term, net exports goes up, and that results in an increase in GDP. So then that's why we talk about the J-curve. So if I were to draw the J-curve over here, so remember the J-curve is the x-axis represents time, and the y-axis represents the trade balance, where this line in the middle is, let's assume, a neutral trade balance, so 0. Initially, if there is a fall in the terms of trade, you'll get a decline in the trade balance, but over time, as the country becomes more competitive, we end up with a higher trade balance. Okay, so then you have short term over here, and then long term over here. That is